North Texas sure is a beautiful part of our country. You know, this region has been sought after and fought over by no fewer than 6 sovereign nations. Make that 7 if you count the Comanche and Kiowa and other native people who dominated this land long before the white man ever even thought about setting foot here. Everybody wants a piece of the Lone Star pie. What you're about to see is an account of the life of a true frontiersman and a pioneer of the cattle business here in Texas. A man willing to risk everything for his chance at living the American dream. He was a tall man with red hair, and it's been said he was completely without fear, but lacking in some of the more picturesque vices of the frontier. He didn't curse or smoke, and was firm in his religious beliefs. For the next few minutes, we'll recount his story and learn a fair bit about Texas in the bargain. When push came to shove, Oliver Loving bet on himself in a life-or-death gamble. The odds were against him, and the stakes could not have been higher for the man who came to be known as the Dean of Texas Trail Drivers. Oliver Loving was born on December 4th of the year 1812 in Hopkins County, Kentucky. The fourth of 9 children born to Joseph and Susanna Borland Loving. He grew up farming the land, as his father had and his father's father before him. When Oliver was 21, he married Miss Susan Doggett Morgan, a daughter of a well-to-do landowner and 4 years his senior. In all her life, Miss Susan had never learned how to cook or sew, instead depending upon slaves to do this work. For the next 10 years in Kentucky, the Lovings grew crops, raised livestock, and brought up 5 children. Mommy. The Peters Colony, an impresario group organized to encourage migration, had emissaries in Kentucky to recruit settlers for North Texas. The Lovings had heard the talk of thriving prairies, rich dark earth, tall grasses, and traversable rivers to the west. In 1844, at the urging of their sister Dorinda, who had made the journey the year before, and Colonel James Borland, another kinsman, who was a customs agent for the Republic, Oliver and his brother James, together with their sister Evelyn and all their families, packed up possessions, lock, stock, and barrel, and left Kentucky forever, immigrating to Texas. The Lovings chose to make the move at an opportune time in history. Texas had been independent from Mexico for almost 10 years. And the salvation of the Republic would depend upon an increase in population. Texas needed more citizens to bring in new money. stimulate trade and commerce, pay taxes, man the army and navy, fight Indians, and push back the frontier. And in various other ways support the fledgling republic. Texas was attractive to settlers for many reasons. The land itself was either dirt cheap or available at a nominal price, and there was a lot of it. Under the Preemption Act alone, nearly 5 million acres were granted. Under this act, anyone who settled, lived on and made improvements on up to 320 acres of land could buy title to it at 50 cents an acre after 3 years. In addition, annexation by the United States was imminent. Democratic presidential nominee James K. Polk ran on a platform that embraced American territorial expansionism, an idea soon to be referred to as manifest destiny. At their convention, the Democrats had called for the annexation of Texas specifically. And it should also be noted that Texas had no extradition policies, and therefore was safe haven for those in dire straits legally and financially. Individuals from numerous states, and even some foreign countries, loaded their goods and kin into wagons and posted signs saying, "Gone to Texas," where creditors and men with warrants could not follow, and there was an ample opportunity to start over. Now, in those days, travel was a far cry from what it is today. The loving group embarked on a passage of almost 3 months, from beginning to end, commencing with a slow float on a flatboat down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. To this day, a persistent family story tells of young Henry Daniel falling off a platform into the water. When he came up for the 3rd time, his father grabbed him by the hair and saved him. At the southern tip of Louisiana, at New Orleans, when they finally landed, the journey picked up steam. Transferring to riverboat, the group made their way northwest, up the Red River. This waterway had only recently been made navigable. By the efforts of Captain Henry Miller Shreve, an inventor steamboat captain, and in 1832, superintendent of Western River Improvement. By the year 1838, using snag boats of his own design and a crew of 200 men, the Great Raft, an ancient series of log jams, was removed from the river from Natchitoches and north for hundreds of miles. By clearing logs and debris and dredging channels, Shreve restored the flow of water to Shreveport, the city named for him, and beyond. Soon barges and boats were hauling passengers and freight up and down the Red River, going as far west as they could, creating the bustling river port town of Jefferson, at the very end of Caddo Lake and the Big Cypress Bayou in the Republic of Texas. Jefferson flourished, quickly became a major port, and was second only to Galveston in the number of goods shipped from Texas. The first steamboat reached Jefferson in 1845. Jefferson served as a commercial center in several respects. It was the point of embarkation for people moving west and the supply center for people located in the Northeast. It was also the conduit for goods moving from the area, the most important of which was cotton. Cotton was transported to Jefferson by a freight wagon. Then it was shipped to New Orleans. To New Orleans, where the Cotton Exchange was located. After their journey up the Red River, the Lovings disembarked their steamboat and procured wagons and oxen. They bought all the provisions they needed to finish the trip and supply their new life on the frontier. Some of the household items included a Seth Thomas mantel clock with brass movement, a spinning wheel and loom, a feather bed, a chest of drawers, weapons and ammunition. Some weeks later, they arrived in Lamar County. They rented a tract of land and planted a crop of corn. Then late in the summer, Oliver and his brother traveled westward in search of a permanent place to settle. James liked the area bordering Rowlett Creek, with its immense fields of hip-high grass. He received a grant for 640 acres and became the 16th family to take up residence in Dallas County. Oliver was awarded a similar tract in what was to become Collin County, and soon moved to Plano, where he was engaged much of the time in hauling freight, farming, and raising stock. Any discussion of Texas history must include the lasting influence that the Spanish conquest of the New World has had upon our culture. Beginning with the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492 and continuing for over 300 some odd years, the Spanish Empire would expand over most of present-day Central America and Mexico, the Caribbean islands, and the Southwest and Pacific coast here in the U.S. Development of trade and furthering of Catholicism were the main motivations for Spain's colonial expansion. As it turns out, it was far easier to expose natives to deadly diseases unintentionally than it was to convert them to Christianity. The indigenous populations had no natural immunity and were decimated in most cases. The first Spanish mission in Texas was established in 1632. The missions, which were to number some 26 in all, persisted until the Mexican Revolution in 1821 severed all ties with Spain. In Texas, there was an added benefit to having the missions. For a time, they were an effective buffer zone to inhibit the French and other foreign nations from encroaching upon Spanish claims.
Oh no! What is the meaning of this, monsieur? Say, look here.
The Spanish brought livestock with them to supply their missions and presidios. Presidios were fortified garrisons of Spanish soldiers there to protect the missions. Specifically, cattle and horses were imported. Over time, this practice brought vast change to the lives of those in this region. The nomadic Native American Comanche people, when introduced to the horse, quickly learned how to raise and train these animals. Horses became an integral part of their lives and were used for food, transportation, and currency. The cattle introduced during this period into Mexico and the Southwest would eventually develop into the Longhorn, a breed which flourished in the wild and whose great numbers would ultimately enable the era of the long drive to ensue, when the marketing of these beeves became so profitable after the Civil War. The long drive, pioneered by Loving, Goodnight, Chisholm, and others, would pave the way for the cattle industry to prosper in Texas, as well as many other beef-producing states. Oliver Loving was 33 years old in 1845 when he and his party arrived in Texas. That same year, Texas became the 28th state of the Union. His first cousin, once removed, Colonel James Borland, owned land in Lamar County. He had encouraged the Lovings to migrate to Texas. Oliver's sister Dorinda and her husband Felix Miller were in Lamar too. More than likely, arrangements were made through them for the weary group to lay over for an interim period before pushing on to settle farther west. The young Charles Goodnight, future friend and partner, then merely 9 years old, also came to Texas that year. In 1846, Loving homesteaded 640 acres of land in 3 patents spread through Collin, Dallas, and Parker counties. The largest tract, some 544 acres, in Collin County served as the family's home base. There they were occupied raising horses and cattle and farming for about 9 years. Oliver himself focused on the contract freight trade. He hauled back and forth from Jefferson, supplied the U.S. military post on the frontier, and even worked as far south as Houston, all the while collecting knowledge about the region and networking his business contacts. Through the mercantile enterprise that he started with his son James, he kept his large fleet of ox-drawn wagons busy, doing pickup and delivery from Preston on Red River in Grayson County to Fort Belknap on the Brazos in Jack County. The census for 1850 listed Oliver Loving as a farmer with holdings worth $1,740. In 1855, at the age of 43, he sold his holdings in Collin County, moved farther west and settled in what is now known as Loving's Valley, on Belknap Road near Keechee Creek. In Palo Pinto, the family owned and operated a general store, and Loving began to trade in cattle more extensively than ever before. He successfully moved herds to Shreveport and New Orleans, the latter being the main venue for beef at the time, and the least dangerous route to market Texas cattle. In 1856, a leading cattleman of McLennan County named Claiborne Varner hired a couple of greenhorns to move his select herd of 430 longhorns to grazing land in Palo Pinto. The 2 novices were 20-year-old Charlie Goodnight and his stepbrother Wesley Sheik. The deal was that the boys would tend the cattle and in return receive 1 out of every 4 calves as pay for themselves. This was Goodnight's beginning in the cattle business. While in Palo Pinto, Goodnight found his way into Keechee Valley, where he met Oliver Loving. Charlie realized that the older, more experienced Loving recognized no compunction of hardship, peril, or distance. They shared a kindred spirit of interest in the cattle business, and likewise both had more than a passing acquaintance with bullwhacking supplies over the wide-open plains of Texas. Oliver had already begun driving cattle to Shreveport, Alexandria, and New Orleans. In 1857, Goodnight joined the Texas Rangers. That same year, Oliver Loving sent his son William and their neighbor John Durkee on their first major cattle drive up the Shawnee Trail, all the way to southern Illinois. With William acting as the trail boss.
Dear Father and Mother, I take the present opportunity to write you a few lines informing you that we are all on the land of the living. We've made the trip through and have sold our cattle, I think tolerable well. We sold for $38 per head. We had a very hard time crossing the Missouri River. Owing to the dry weather, water was very scarce. Roads so dusty that we could not see each other but a few rods. I do not know when we will get to start home, not for 2 or 3 weeks. We want the weather to get some cooler. Mr. Pugh and many others is coming to Texas. We want to get in company with them if they are not too long getting off. We had tolerable good luck, lost 6 steers and 1 pony. Our cattle looked as well when we got here as they did when we left Texas. Mares such as we want is gonna cost high. Our ponies look bad. We're going to Mr. Durkee's brothers in the morning to fatten our pony. I think we'll make a fair profit on them. I have not gotten homesick yet, and I don't think I shall. I have not heard but very little from Texas since we left. Mr. Durkee got home a few days ago. If Dillingham has not beat you in your land suit, I think you would do well to hold on and not sell for a while. There's gonna be a very heavy immigration to Texas this fall. Tell Susan, if she's got any letters for me, hold on to them. I think I'll be there in the course of 2 months to read them myself. I expect you're scolding me for not writing oftener. I will admit I ought to have done so, but I write as often as I had time and opportunities. I must bring my few lines to a close. We are all well and have been all the trip. The expenses on our cattle has been about $2 per head. We have cleared on the whole drove $5,000. Excuse bad writing, spelling, and mistakes. Your son, William W. Loving. August 2nd, 1857.
This route proved so effective that Loving repeated it twice in the next 2 years. By the summer of 1860, folks had heard about the gold discovered in Colorado, and the Pikes Peak area was surging with growth. Loving partnered up with John Dawson, Joel Curtis, and Sil Reed to drive a herd north out of Texas, then west along the Arkansas River past Bent's Fort, and wintered to the north of Pueblo, selling in Denver come spring for the burgeoning mining crowd. Charles Goodnight, then a seasoned scout, guide, and a respected member of the Texas Rangers, wrote later of helping the group trail the cattle as far as the Red River. This may well have been Charlie and Oliver's first professional pursuit together. Goodnight later took pride in the fact that he was born in 1836, the same year as the Republic, and that he joined Texas when Texas joined the Union in 1845. While Loving was in Denver, the war between the states broke out, and federal authorities detained him in regards to his status as a damned secessionist. Fortunately, his friends Lucian Maxwell and Kit Carson, both deemed to be fine, upstanding citizens held in high esteem, were possessed of the means to intervene on his behalf and the ability to obtain a passport, which enabled him to finally go home. Oliver Loving made it back to Texas in the summer of 1861. Upon his arrival, he discovered that his whole household had been forced to take up residence in nearby Weatherford for safety. During his long absence, marauding Indians had killed numerous settlers along the frontier, giving rise to the Exodus. To add sadness to sorrow, his son William died in Weatherford soon after Oliver's return. In 1862, Loving wrote a letter to then Governor of Texas, Francis Lubbock. In it, he implores Lubbock for assistance on the matter of Indians depredating in Texas. He also asks for help to free Texans jailed in Denver on account of their Southern sympathies.
Dear Sir, I'm an old frontiersman and have time and again taken a hand in the pursuit of Indians depredating on the frontier. For the last year, I have been absent trading to Pikes Peak with cattle and passing to that country. I ascertained that the general rendezvous of the Indians who depredate upon the frontier is upon the Arkansas River, say 350 or 400 miles from here. As I returned home some 2 months since, I saw a large number of Comanches with some 4,000 or 5,000 horses stolen from Texas. These Indians are fed by the U.S. posts at Fort Adams and Fort Bent on the Arkansas. The Indians are paid by the U.S. troops occupying these parts for all the scalps taken in Texas. They are perfectly friendly with the U.S. troops and in fact with all except Texans. I am satisfied that we will not have any rest from these Indians until we go to their general rendezvous and destroy them. I am satisfied that with a few companies of good men, great good can be done by an expedition against them. I had a talk with Colonel Norris of the Texas Frontier Regiment a few days since. I want his cooperation in the expedition. Now I propose this to raise, say, 3 or 4 companies of men for the expedition to act in conjunction with Colonel Norris, or under his command, if that be more desirable. I propose not only to break up and destroy this encampment of Indians, but I propose also to take the U.S. posts in the neighborhood of these Indians, a thing that can be easily done because the troops stationed have been ordered off to the assistance of the federal troops in New Mexico. Besides, there is a large amount of military stores and property of various kinds at these posts, which we could take and destroy. Now, I am aware that the present contest with the Yankee foe overshadows everything else. But this is a matter that concerns the people of the Texas frontier. I propose that these men that I shall raise shall go into the Confederate States service as you may desire. And I propose that they will go without $1's pay from the government if matters are so that they cannot be paid by the government. And the reason I ask for your interposition in this matter at all is because it is almost impossible to control men in such an expedition without their being governed by state or Confederate authority. I only want the matter so fixed that the expedition can be governed and controlled. Now, I do not know that this matter is in your power. If it is, in any way, so that I can organize the expedition under the management of Colonel Norris, if it be necessary, I would be satisfied. I am perfectly confident of the success of the enterprise if the assistance of the government can be obtained. I would also, with the expedition, go to Denver City, the capital of Pikes Peak, and release some 60 or 70 prisoners now in jail there on account of their Southern principles, and in my judgment I could exterminate the Indians who have for so many years depredated on this frontier. I desire to start about the 1st of June. In the talk I had with Colonel Norris, I thought he was disposed to listen to the suggestions, and he is now preparing to make an expedition. I hope this matter will receive your very best reflection and that you may be able to assist in the matter. In other words, give me authority to raise the men, and if that cannot be done, then assist in any way that can be done to effect the object sought. Respectfully, Oliver Loving, 1862.
Herds of cattle won't trail in one big group, but strung out in a long line. Instinctive leaders took their positions in front, and the others fell into an uneven line behind them. 1,000 head might stretch out a mile or more on the trail. The dozen or so drovers on each crew all had very specific jobs. They worked in pairs, one on either side of the line. The most experienced and skillful were assigned as pointers at the head of the herd. The 2 pointers kept everything oriented in the proper direction and set the pace for the drive. Several other men worked the flank and swing positions farther back. The swing and flankers rode on either side and patrolled the line to keep the cows from wandering from the rest. The hardest position, the drag riders, rode at the end of the line and kept the slower cattle from straggling too far behind. They also caught all the dust generated by the entire bunch.
It takes a lot of hands at roundup, too. Out at daybreak, breakfast at the chuck wagon, and then get the horses in. Get a rope on the first pony in your string, and saddle up for the morning's work.
Then there was the horse wrangler, who was in charge of the remuda, which was a group of horses that had been saddle broken. Often, the wrangler was the youngest member of the outfit. He was a boy who was man enough to do what it took. The trail boss was the man in charge of the outfit and was hired by the owner of the cattle to drive the herd to market.
All right, hallelujah. What is it this time?
Oh, nothing. Nothing at all. I got grub cooked for 25 cowhands. Where's the cowhands?
The trail boss had to make sure the longhorns got enough grass and water and did not lose weight during the trip. He decided how far the outfit would travel each day and where it would stop for the night. He was the one who negotiated with the Indians and white settlers who objected to the herds crossing their land. The trail boss would move a herd 12 to 16 miles a day. If the animals were allowed to graze and gain some weight en route, the pace would be less. The boss was the ultimate authority on the trail.
Obey the law. This one that starts anything will answer to me.
The next most important member of the crew was the cook.
You driving a herd and all? I want to put an idea like that in your head. We just sashaying these critters up and down and up so they'll get an appetite for the victuals. Won't get too fat in the middle.
There were numerous hazards on the trail. Stampedes, bad weather, Indians. Injuries could come in any number of ways. Your mount could be spooked by a rattlesnake or step into a gopher hole at a full run. The greatest danger was in the crossing of rivers. Men feared these crossings above all else, because the average cowboy could not swim, and drowning was not an uncommon fate. Throughout the duration of the conflict, known in the South as the War of Northern Aggression, Oliver Loving supplied much-needed beef and pork
Smells good.
to Confederate forces at Jefferson, Shreveport, Alexandria, and at locations spanning the Mississippi. The proceeds from the contracts that he fulfilled for the thousands of cattle delivered in support of the Southern cause would have made him a wealthy man, but instead, what with the outcome favoring the North, he found himself holding a reported $150,000 in worthless Confederate script and deeply in debt.
What do you want me to do? Draw you a picture?
In 1865, Charles Goodnight was 29 years old. When he and Sheik's agreement with Varner matured that year, they bought out their benefactor's interest and set about making a drive to market the beeves. Though he was an experienced plainsman, Indian fighter, and had raised and worked cattle most of his young life, his first attempt at a drive ended tragically. The entire herd was stampeded and stolen by Indians. The legendary collaboration between Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving began in 1866. The alliance between the two men who would be giants combined the impressive capabilities of both. The strong young plainsman and Indian fighter who knew the hills and valleys of Texas like the back of his hand. And the mature, expert cattleman and trailblazer, able to command massive herds over the worst terrain under any conditions. Goodnight and Loving teamed up to drive a 2,000-head mixed herd to Denver, accompanied by 18 cowboys armed to the teeth. They left the frontier of Texas on June 6th. The trail that was blazed went down in history as the Goodnight-Loving Trail. from Fort Belknap. The drovers traveled on past Camp Cooper. And on west by the chimneys of old Fort Phantom Hill. From there through Buffalo Gap and by Fort Chadbourne, and on southwest across the North Concho, about 20 miles above where San Angelo would later be. They crossed the divide to the Middle Concho and followed its course due west, stopping at the Middle Concho headwaters for a last good drink. And to get ready for crossing the Llano Estacado. The most arduous stretch of the drive. 80 miles of waterless plain. By way of Centralia Draw. As the mile-wide Castle Gap Canyon opens the way through the Castle Mountains on the western edge of the plains. 12 miles beyond the gap was Horsehead Crossing on the Pecos River. A welcome destination for much-needed respite after 3 days and nights in the saddle.
I was barely 21 when we drove that first herd to New Mexico in 1865. There weren't any great cattle trails then, just 1,000 miles of open country, and a whole lot of Indians that we tried real hard to go around. Our cowboys had one job, to get those steers up the trail. Problem was, steers never seemed to know that. But everybody had his job. It took about a dozen cowboys to keep them in line and moving in the right direction. To communicate, we used signals we borrowed from the Indian, who were pretty good herders themselves. On a good day, we could move them about 15 miles. But heading west, after we left the Middle Concho River, it was 80 miles to the next water at the Pecos River, so we just kept them moving, day and night. I mean, you just lived on a horse. We called it putting out to sea because the prairie was like a mighty ocean. It was hard, dangerous work, but I'll tell you flat, it was a beautiful land, unspoiled by the marks of man. And we were all blessed to be there.
Goodnight rode a dozen miles ahead of the herd, scouting for water, grazing sites, and always keeping an eye peeled for Indian signs. Oliver and the other men broke the herd to trailing condition and followed across the seemingly limitless plains. But there was a huge obstacle ahead. The Llano Estacado, a waterless stretch of over 80 miles of treeless desert, pristine in its isolation and bereft of any settlement, where renegade bands of Comanche ran amok, in a place that white men shunned like the plague. They held the herd at the water for a day at the Concho River, allowing the parched beeves to drink their fill. An attempt was made to bed down the cattle, but they wouldn't sleep. It was determined then to continue on, non-stop, until they got to the Pecos, or risk losing the herd. For 3 days and nights, the depleted procession progressed westward, over the desolate landscape. On the second day in the desert, the cattle stampeded when they thought they smelled water in a canyon. By the third day, the crazed beasts were veritably uncontrollable, and when the herd came near the Pecos, towards the close of that day, the frenzied creatures stampeded once more, this time careening pell-mell over the banks and out into the river. Hundreds drowned. Helplessly bogged down in quicksand as they piled into the water on top of each other. After recovering and watering the herd sufficiently, the partners headed north up the river. The stuck cattle were left in the quicksand banks where they landed. Goodnight later called the Pecos the graveyard of a cowman's hopes. Originally, the beeves were to be sold in Denver. As they worked the herd north up the Pecos toward Colorado, they passed near the reservation at Fort Sumner, the Bosque Redondo, where 8,500 Navajo Indians were sequestered by the Army. The reservation had been set up 3 years before in the hopes that encouraging the Navajo to farm their own food would sustain the populace. This expectation had not been met. In 65 and 66, corn production had been ample, but in 67, the crop would be a disaster. Indian agents and Army officers realized that the experiment was a failure. Bad water and a shortage of firewood accounted for the lack of success. At Fort Sumner, Loving and Goodnight sold all the steers for $12,000 in gold, and Goodnight took 3 hands and headed back to Texas to build another herd with the proceeds. Several hundred cows and calves, which the Army had turned down, would go with Loving to Denver for sale. But the Army was willing to pay top dollar for more steers to be delivered. Loving drove the rest of the herd to Denver, sold them to the local stockman, John Iliff, and adjourned to the Bosque Grande, below Fort Sumner, to await the second herd. Goodnight, having learned from the previous trip, made the drive without incident and arrived late in the fall. Loving and Goodnight had kept their business affairs separate up to this point. But at Bosque Grande, they agreed to split the proceeds between them in an equal partnership, sharing the risk as well as the profits and losses. No contract was needed. A handshake over the campfire was sufficient. For these men were as good as their word. The group wintered there in the bosque, and the stock was doled out in Colorado and New Mexico as needed throughout the spring. Then they proceeded back to Texas without incident and began buying up cattle for another drive straight away. In 1867, Oliver Loving and Charles Goodnight had gathered another herd of 2,500 head at Black Springs in Jack County. On June 1st, they left with the cattle for Fort Sumner. A few days into the journey, a band of Comanche looking to steal horses snuck up before dawn and opened fire on the sleeping cattlemen near old Camp Cooper. One of the drovers was shot in the head with a steel arrow. As luck would have it, he survived, after the point was pulled out with a pair of hoof nippers and the wound covered with mud.
Late in the night, it commenced to storm fearfully and became very dark. At times, the lightning was intense. During such flashes, we could see clearly. By 1 o'clock, the storm became so dense and the wind at such velocity, we had to stop. Once cattle start to stampede, their nervousness spreads as by contagion. Night after night, they have been known to run, each time to exhaustion, until fat beef steers were but ghosts of their former prime. And they are not easy to stop. This drive of 1867 was such an experience.
They were attacked again on the lower Pecos, and some 60 cattle were taken. The men moved up with the remainder of the herd, keeping to the high ground as much as possible and going to the river each day for water. They'd made it another 150 miles with no sign of Indians, but Loving was restless to go on. The contract for furnishing beef was to be let in July, and he was anxious to make the deal.
Loving was a man of religious instincts and one of the coolest and bravest men I have ever known, but devoid of caution. In 1867, we started another herd west and struck the Pecos the latter part of June. After we had gone up this river about 100 miles, it was decided that Mr. Loving should go ahead on horseback in order to reach New Mexico in time to bid on the contracts. Since the journey was to be made with a one-man escort, I selected Bill Wilson, the clearest-headed man in the outfit, as his companion.
Mr. Loving asked me to go to Fort Sumner, New Mexico, with him. We had a verbal contract with the people who were feeding the Indians there, and we wanted to hold that contract. The distance to Fort Sumner was about 250 miles, and we were supposed to travel at night and lay up in the daytime so the Indians would not attack us.
Knowing the dangers of traveling through an Indian-infested country, I endeavored to impress on these men the fact that only by traveling by night could they hope to make the trip in safety.
The second day of our journey, we stopped on a stream we called Black River. and stayed there 2 or 3 hours, rested up our horses, then concluded to go on to the point of a mountain where the road ran between the mountain and the river, and stay there that night.
The first 2 nights after the journey was begun, they followed my instructions, but Loving, who detested night riding, persuaded Wilson that I had been overcautious, and one fine morning they changed their tactics and proceeded by daylight. Nothing happened until 2 o'clock that afternoon, when Wilson, who had been keeping a lookout, sighted the Comanches heading toward them from the southwest.
As we neared this mountain, we discovered several Indians. They saw us about the same time, and we knew we were in for trouble.
The men left the trail and made for the Pecos River, which was about 4 miles to the northwest and was the nearest place they could hope to find shelter.
We reached the river all right. I picked out a little mound next to the river where I could see all around me, except one little spot where the polecat brush had grown up about 3 feet high, and that brush obscured my view of the river for a distance of about 100 yards. The bushes were about 40 yards from where I was standing. I kept my eyes on this spot, for I knew if a demonstration was made from that direction, the Indians would charge us from the hill.
By the moonlight, I call you mine.
I told Mr. Loving if he would stay down at that little clump of bushes and keep the Indians from crawling up on us from the river, I would keep them off from above. These Indians had increased in numbers until there were over 100 of the red rascals.
The men scrambled down this bluff, where they hid themselves among the sand dunes and breaks of the river. Meantime, the Indians were hot on their track. Some of them halted on the bluff, and others crossed the river and surrounded the men.
After staying in the brush a little while, Mr. Loving came up to where I was, and I urged him to go back there and prevent the Indians from coming in on us from the river. An Indian rose up. I shot him, but not before he had fired on Mr. Loving. The Indian's shot went through Loving's holsters, passed through his wrist, and entered his left side. At this time, the Indians made a desperate charge, and after I had emptied my 5-shooter Yarger, I picked up Mr. Loving's gun and continued firing. There was some brush, only a few inches high, and the Indians would run to it, crawl on their bellies, and I could not see them. I managed to get Mr. Loving down to the river and concealed him in a sandy depression and laid down beside him. The Indians knew we were down there somewhere. They would shoot their arrows up, and some came very near striking us. Finally, an Indian with a long lance came crawling along, parting the weeds with his lance as he came. And just about the time I had determined to pull the trigger, he scared up a big rattlesnake. The snake came out rattling, looking back at the Indian, and coiled up right near us. The Indian, who still had not seen us, evidently got scared at the rattlesnake and turned back. We laid there until night. Mr. Loving's wounds had thrown him into a high fever, and I managed to bring up some water from the river in his boot, which seemed to relieve him somewhat. About midnight, the moon went down, but the Indians were still around us. We could hear them on all sides. Mr. Loving begged me to leave him and make my escape so I could tell his folks what had become of him. He said he felt sure he could not last until morning, and if I stayed there, I would be killed too. He insisted that I take his gun, as it used metallic cartridges, and I could carry it through the water and not dampen the powder. I took his gun and with a hand clasp told him goodbye and started to the river. The river was quite sandy and difficult to swim in, so I had to pull off all of my clothes except my hat, my shirt, and my breeches. The gun nearly drowned me, and I decided to get along without it, so I leaned it up against the bank of the river under the water, where the Indians would not find it. Then I went down the river about 100 yards, saw an Indian sitting on his horse. He was sitting there splashing the water with his foot, just playing. I got under some smartweeds and drifted by until I got far enough below the Indian where I could get out.
Wilson turned over to Lovin all of the pistols and his 6-shooting rifle, and taking the Henry rifle, departed. How he expected to cross the river with the gun I have never comprehended, for Wilson was a one-armed man. But it shows what lengths a person will attempt in extreme emergencies. When Wilson decided to start, he divested himself of clothing except underwear and hat. He floated noiselessly down the river, and though the Indians were all around, he fearlessly began his getaway.
Then I made a 3 days march barefooted. Everything in that country had stickers in it.
He climbed up a bank and crawled out through a cane brake and started out to find me, barefooted, and over ground that was covered with prickly pear, mesquite, and other thorny plants.
Everything in that country had stickers in it. The last night of this painful journey, the wolves followed me all night. I would give out, just like a horse, and lay down in the road and drop off to sleep. And when I would awaken, the wolves would be all around me, snapping and snarling. I would take up that stick, knock the wolves away, get started again, and the wolves would follow behind. I kept that up until daylight, when the wolves quit me. About 12 o'clock on that last day, I crossed a little mountain and knew the boys ought to be right in there somewhere with the cattle.
Of course, he was obliged to travel by night at first, but fearing starvation, used the day some when he was out of sight of the Indians. Wilson took refuge from the scorching sun to rest in a cave. Then he came out of the cave and looked for the herd and saw it coming up the valley. When I came within a quarter of a mile of the cave, Wilson gave me the frontier sign to come to him. He was between me and the declining sun, and since his underwear was saturated with red sediment from the river, he made a queer-looking object. After he had rested and gotten himself together, he said, "I think Mr. Lovin has died from his wounds. He sent me to deliver a message to you." It was to the effect that he had received a mortal wound, but before he would allow the Indians to take him and torture him, he would kill himself. But in case he lived, he would go 2 miles down the river from where we were, and there we would find him.
I found a little place, a sort of a cave, that afforded protection from the sun, and I could go no farther. After a short time, the boys came along with the cattle and found me. Charles Goodnight took a party of about 14 men and pulled out to see about Mr. Loving. After riding about 24 hours, they came to the spot where I had left him, but he was not there.
Goodnight concluded that his partner had shot himself rather than be captured, and that his body had gone down the river. They rode back to the herd that night in deep, deep sorrow. Loving had survived, though, against the odds. For 2 nights and as many days, he'd hunkered down in the hollow. The Comanche had been unsuccessful after numerous attempts to dislodge him. Because so much time had passed, Loving reasoned that Wilson had been killed before being able to alert Goodnight, and that there would be no rescue. So on the 3rd night, hearing no sound of Indians, he slipped into the river and went upstream to a crossing where he figured help might pass by. There he lay for another 2 nights and a day, famished and feeble, having had no food since the ordeal began. He survived by tying his neckerchief to a stick and dipping it into the river for water. Finally, he passed out, until at last a group of Mexicans and a German boy, resting their ox team at the crossing, discovered the wounded man and agreed to transport him to Fort Sumner, where he was put under the care of a doctor at the post. Goodnight, who in the meantime had continued the herd on towards the fort, reacted with disbelief when informed by an acquaintance who had been at Fort Sumner of Loving's true disposition at the fort. Goodnight hastened to his partner's side. Removal of the arm was the only treatment, but Loving had insisted that his partner be there with him during the procedure. After Goodnight's arrival, the operation was again postponed due to trepidation on the part of the inexperienced physician. Ultimately, Goodnight threatened the doctor with bodily harm if he did not operate. With that, the arm was severed the same day. The initial improvement was waylaid. Additional surgery was required. Oliver Loving's normally hardy constitution was so diminished by the fiasco that it proved insufficient to the task.
And we prevailed upon the doctor to cut off the affected limb, but too late.
He gradually faded and slipped away 22 days later at the age of 54 years.
Mortification went into his body and killed him.
Before he passed, he implored his friend to continue their business partnership until the debt on his family had been lifted.
If my wings should fail below, please meet me with another.
And also that he not be laid away in a foreign country, but buried back in Texas.
Thus ended the career of one of the best men I ever knew. Mr. Goodnight had the body of Mr. Loving prepared for the long journey and carried it to Weatherford, Texas, where interment was made with Masonic honors. Bill Wilson.
There is some disagreement as to who actually brought Oliver Loving's remains back to Texas.
All that I know is that the Loving family said when the body was brought back, there was no sign of Goodnight. It may have been Goodnight's idea. He may have been told to do it by Oliver Loving, may have organized it, but the Loving family claims he was nowhere to be seen when the body was brought to Weatherford. That's all that I know.
He was taken back over the Goodnight Loving Trail, hundreds of miles, all the way to Loving's home in Weatherford, to his family. The strangest and most touching funeral cavalcade in the history of cow country, wrote J. Evetts Haley. Oliver Loving left a comfortable situation in Kentucky. He traveled close to 1,000 miles to carve out a livelihood for himself and his family in this relentless and at times unforgiving environment. Oliver Loving was reburied in Greenwood Cemetery in Weatherford, Texas, on March 4th, 1868.
When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss and poor contempt on all my pride. Forbid it, Lord, that I should boast, save in the death of Christ my God. All the vain things that charm me most, I sacrifice them to his blood. See from his head, his hands, his feet, sorrow and love flow mingled down Love demands my soul. My